3i Atlas flew along its hyperbole and, if we are to believe the dry formulations, posed no threat. The problem is that threats almost never begin with a blow. They begin with an inconsistency that you're embarrassed to say out loud at first because it sounds like a fantasy. Something small and repetitive, something that shouldn't match but does, and that's exactly how it all started. On Monday morning, the first hole appeared in the telemetry feed. A brief loss of signal on one of the communication satellites. Nothing dramatic. These things happen. Brief interference, orientation issues, radio shadows, routing failures. A minute later, the connection returned, as if nothing had happened. The duty shift noted it and moved on. 2 hours later, the hole reoccurred, but on a different device. Again, it lasted for almost the same minute, and then it returned to normal, as smoothly as if the system had been turned off and back on with a single button. The report read boringly, signal dropout, recovered, no further action. That's what they write when they don't want to appear paranoid. By the evening of that same day, the table already contained 5 similar episodes, 5 different spacecraft, 5 different orbits, 5 different operators, and one common detail that shouldn't have existed: timing. The signal losses occurred at the same minutes, spaced out by seconds, as if someone were checking off boxes on a schedule. The next day, statistics ceased to be statistics. In the same window, precisely the same 2 minutes, 3 satellites simultaneously fell. One meteorological, one observation, one relay. From the ground, it looked like a chain of minor inconveniences. Frames dropped, transmissions interrupted, a piece of the map arrived late. But inside the control centers, the silence was different. Not work-like, cautious. I know what work panic sounds like. It's loud, it's tense. There are lots of commands, lots of swearing, lots of coffee, and this silence was as if no one wanted to be the first to say what everyone else already understood. Because at precisely the same moment that the dropouts were occurring in orbit, ground-based radio telescopes picked up a pulse. Narrow, directional. Not solar interference, not a passing aircraft, not a satellite in low orbit. The pulse was coming from the sector of the sky where Atlas was moving. It wasn't NASA that noticed it first. That's always the case. The first oddities usually come from below, where people aren't obligated to explain things to their superiors and the press service. A small group of radio engineers looking at the raw data spotted a pattern and tried to chalk it up to a filtering error. They double-checked the calibrations, they double-checked the frequency masks, they double-checked everything that usually saves them from embarrassment. The momentum remains, then everything moved in a chain. Requests, time verification, coordination of scales. And suddenly, names that had previously been spoken separately were suddenly listed together. DSN, ALMA, VLA, JPL. People who usually communicated through reports began to converse directly. On the third day, NASA launched what would officially be called a signal cross-validation campaign. Internally, it was simply called Gather Everything We Have and Tell Us Honestly What We See, because the match was too neat. The satellite's signal losses, it turned out, weren't random. They coincided in timing with the radio pulses, and the radio pulses coincided in direction with Atlas's position in the sky at that moment. And the most disturbing thing, the geometry offered no easy way out. The pulse wasn't coming from somewhere nearby. It was coming from a narrow corridor that moved alongside the object, as if the object itself were a beacon. You might say, comets emit noise. Space is full of noise. Yes, they emit noise. Yes, it's full. But noise is never so disciplined. Noise doesn't come in windows. Noise doesn't synchronize with other infrastructure. Noise doesn't appear precisely when 3 different spacecraft in 3 different orbits simultaneously lose contact. Then a question arose that one always wants to dismiss. What's losing contact? Are the satellites losing contact with Earth, or is Earth losing contact with the satellites? The wording seems similar, but the meaning is different, and the latter meaning is worse. If it was just interference, then it should have been widespread. That's how the sun works. That's how lightning works. That's how space weather works. But here it was targeted and economical, as if someone didn't want to break everything, but wanted to touch just what was needed to see the reaction. On the 4th day, one of the teams did what they always do when logic starts to unravel. They tried to find a simple human source, a time synchronization error, a glitch in the orbital update system, a problem with a new patch, a protocol incompatibility. All of this can be fixed, and most importantly, it's not a big deal. But when they started combing through the incidents online, it turned out that it wasn't just the minutes of the outages that matched, the patterns matched too. The satellites didn't die. They didn't go into safe mode. They didn't switch to emergency profiles. They simply became inaudible. It was as if someone had turned off the very channel between orbit and the ground for a few seconds. Not the satellite, not the antenna, the channel. If you've ever seen dead telemetry, you know normal problems leave a trace. Correction errors. CRC tails, power dips, Here, there was almost no trace. In the logs, it looked as if the world had momentarily lost contact with one another. On the fifth day, the radio pulses became more complex. Not louder, not longer, more complex. They began arriving not as a single frequency, but in packets, several narrow lines like a comb, all within a single window. During these same windows, the outages affected not only communication satellites, but also 2 Earth observation satellites, which operated on a completely different pattern. And that was the turning point. Because communications are like nerves. It can be explained by interference. But when surveillance equipment starts to falter, when identical black stripes appear in the footage and then disappear as if they were never there, it starts to look like interference with the electronics. And then interference ceases to be just a word. NASA did what it always does when it needs to buy time. Nothing public, no press releases, no grandiose statements, just brief technical issues and a few systems that don't impact safety. That's the standard. That's what they write when they still don't know what to call what's happening internally. But internally, meetings began where no one cared about the fine-grained wording. They were interested in a question that would never arise in a good world. If this is a test, then who's testing it? We're used to thinking that infrastructure testing can be done by humans, by a government, by an organization. But here the question wasn't who, but where, because the impulse's direction was tied to Sector Atlas, and the whole thing was becoming too precise to be a coincidence. By the 6th day, the picture had gotten even worse, as a second correlation emerged. During radio pulses, GPS accuracy dropped slightly in several regions, unnoticeable to most people, but noticeable to those who watch time metrics like a surgeon watches a pulse. It wasn't a global collapse. It was a slight trembling shift that could be attributed to the ionosphere, but the ionosphere doesn't like schedules, and this one had a schedule. When I say scary, I don't mean the emotions. I mean what people do when their emotions are turned off. They start building models, and the models tell them unpleasant things. The first unpleasant thing was simple. The radio pulses were in a wide beam. They were narrow. This meant the source wasn't spreading noise in all directions. It was aiming, and if it was aiming, it meant there was a target. The second unpleasant thing, the pulses were too stable in shape. Even when their pack became more complex, the basic pattern repeated itself. It was as if someone was running the same procedure over and over again, but gradually increasing its intensity. Third, the dropout windows widened, from 1 minute to 2, then to 3. Then they shrank again, but with a different internal pattern. It looked like a tuning test, to see how well the system could withstand the impact and where exactly it was breaking down. At one point, one of the engineers said something that brought that same silence back to the room. It sounds like a ping. It's a simple word, usually used jokingly, but it describes exactly what was happening. A short pulse and a response check. The worst case scenario in such situations is always the same. If someone pings, it means they're expecting a response. The question is, what kind of response do they get? On the 8th day, NASA decided to play a game they don't usually play with the sky. They changed the schedule, reconfigured communication windows, switched some satellites to backup frequencies, shifted several satellites to a different transmission mode. The idea was simple. If the impact is tied to infrastructure, then by changing the infrastructure, the correlation can be disrupted. It worked for exactly 1 cycle. The next time, the impulse arrived a little earlier, and the dropouts came along with it. It was as if someone wasn't just recording the event, but tracking their reaction in real time. I don't like the word "as if" because it turns facts into a mood. But sometimes there's no other word because facts become like behavior, and behavior presupposes a subject. On the 10th day, ALMA, operating in the millimeter range, picked up an additional detail. The pulse wasn't simply coming from the sector, it was traveling with a slight offset, which coincided with the continuation of Atlas's trajectory back to its origin. As if the source wasn't the object itself, but something located along its path, using it as a marker. It looked like a road sign, or a glowing marker in the fog. While engineers were arguing about frequencies, JPL was doing something else, comparing what was happening to the spacecraft with what typically happens during severe space weather. The sun can do nasty things. The sun can turn off radios. The sun can ruin electronics. But the sun has a personality. It has statistics. It has dirt. There was no dirt here. And then something happened that took the story beyond the narrow topic of satellites and radio pulses, into a space where the listener no longer needs to be fascinated by space to feel the cold. During one of the cycles, when the pulse arrived, one of the communication satellites didn't just lose its signal. It began transmitting something it shouldn't have. The short packet fragment looked like a scrap of an old protocol, outdated, decommissioned, used many years ago. It was as if someone had momentarily forced the system to speak a foreign language. This fragment was small. It could have gone unnoticed, but it was noticed, because in a world where everything is calibrated, every foreign byte is a scream. The team dumped the data, extracted the raw data, and saw something strange. The packet contained a structure similar to an echo of something the device had received seconds earlier, not a random echo. Compressed, smoothed as if filtered, and then another hypothesis formed in people's minds, one that had previously seemed too cinematic, that the pulse doesn't just jam, it reads, it touches the electronics in order to see how they work. If this is true, then what's happening does indeed look like an infrastructure test, but not a human test. Too distant, too calm, too frugal. NASA never admits to such things publicly unless absolutely necessary. It's not just politics, it's the physics of trust. Tell people, we don't understand, and they'll hear, we don't control. So publicly, they continue to talk about technical issues, but internally, they're starting to formulate things differently. That's where the word interference comes in. It's neutral. It doesn't accuse. It simply acknowledges that something has entered the system. At the same time, observers began to look at ATLAS differently, not as a beautiful object, not as a rare interstellar comet, but as a piece of geometry around which strange things are happening. And here's the important thing, even if the impulses don't originate from the comet itself, the coincidence with its position makes it part of the mechanism, a marker, a trigger, a key that opens the window. On the 13th day, a third layer appeared. Several independent ground-based observatories noticed that during the pulses, they experienced brief blindness at certain frequencies. Not total, but pinpoint. It was as if someone was closing a shutter on the very bands where they might see something important. This was no longer just an infrastructure test. It looked like surveillance control, like an attempt to control what we see. And at that moment, the story stops being about satellites. It becomes about us, because infrastructure is an extension of civilization's nervous system. And if someone can tug at strings from the distance of interplanetary geometry, then distance ceases to be a defense. Inside NASA, they started doing what they always do when faced with threats: segmenting, separating channels, putting critical systems on standalone mode. Not in a panic, but methodically, because that's how professionals work. They don't shout. They fix vulnerabilities. But the problem is that in this case, the vulnerability might not have been the device itself. It might have been the fact that we built a system that reacts to specific physical conditions, specific frequencies, specific windows. If the impulse is not an attack, but a test, then it seeks patterns. And patterns exist wherever people build standards, wherever there are protocols, wherever there is repeatability. On the 16th day, someone suggested the strangest thing possible. Let's respond. Not publicly, not as a message, but as a technical experiment. Intentionally alter the system's behavior to see if the impulse changes. It was a risk. Because if it really was a test, the response could be interpreted as an invitation. But that's how science sometimes works. You probe the unknown to see if it's alive. They selected several unimportant devices, changed their transmission modes, introduced artificial noise, and made their behavior uncharacteristic. And the next impulse occurred, something that completely turned the room upside down. The pulse changed, it became shorter, and a pause appeared in its structure, right where the systems began transmitting artificial noise, as if the source heard it and adjusted. It didn't prove intelligence, it didn't prove intention, but it did prove connection. And connection is worse than chaos, because chaos can be ignored, but connection means dialogue. On the 18th day, signal loss began to affect not only satellites, but also several ground-based time synchronization systems used for scientific observations. It was unnoticeable in everyday life. But for those working with nanosecond precision, it felt like a tremor in the foundations. At one point, one of the analysts quietly said, "If this is a test, then it's already past the can we see you stage. It's now at the how dependent are you on this stage?" And this phrase didn't sound like a conclusion, it sounded like a sentence, because we truly are dependent. Communication, navigation, synchronization, surveillance. It's all a delicate network around the planet, and if someone can touch the threads of the network, then they can touch what moves along them. What happened next is what in any story always becomes a scene where even a skeptic stops smiling. During one of the cycles, the pulse arrived unexpectedly. It arrived early, and at that moment, several satellites lost contact not for minutes but for hours. It was a jump, too abrupt, too brazen, as if someone had decided to stop being careful. But 3 hours later, the connection returned, and it returned perfectly. The system showed no overheating, no damage, no emergency resets. It was as if they'd been turned off and on again, and while they were off, someone had simply kept their finger on our nerve-wracking button. NASA, of course, didn't confirm this publicly. Publicly, they said the same thing they always did: temporary technical issues. But internally, no one called them problems anymore. Internally, they called it a phase. Phase of what? The testing phase. The tuning phase. The phase where the intervention ceases to be random. The phase where it begins to look like a plan. And here, Atlas regained its meaning, which at first seemed like just a beautiful legend. An interstellar object as a messenger, not because it's alien, but because it's the only thing moving along this line from the outer darkness into our inhabited part of the system. It's a vector, it's an arrow on the map. If you want to test an infrastructure, you need two things: a point in the sky for everyone to look at, and physical geometry for your signal to travel as needed. Atlas could provide both. It could be a trigger, not a tool. It could be a synchronizer, not a source. On the 22nd day, a strange detail appeared in the reports, which they initially tried to ignore. The radio pulse, which coincided with the fallout, began jumping through frequencies, as if trying different keys. First, the ranges used by scientific networks, then those used by commercial networks, then those used by the military, and each time it was brief and careful, as if someone were knocking on a door without breaking it down. It was like a predator first testing its prey for weaknesses, or an engineer testing a system they're about to use. The horror in stories like these isn't always that someone might break something. The horror is that someone might use it, because breaking something is noisy, using it is quiet. On the 24th day, Alma detected another component, a faint, constant carrier wave, that was always present but only became visible during active pulses. It was like a signature, like a background noise that kept the system in sync. And if this is true, then the pulses aren't the only thing going on. There's a constant channel, just too subtle for us to notice. And here comes the most troubling question. How long has this been going on? We've noticed it now because we're looking at Atlas. But if the channel was subtle before us, it could have been there earlier. It could have been part of the noise we've been chalking up to space our whole lives. And if so, then history ceases to be new. It becomes discovered. On the 26th day, someone within the agency suggested checking the simplest thing: whether the fallout windows coincided with the antenna orientation. That is not just time and direction in the sky, but the specific orientation of the equipment relative to the sector where ATLAS was located. And it coincided, not perfect, but enough to make things worse. Where the geometry was correct, the drops were more frequent. Where it was incorrect, they were less frequent. As if the source operated on the principle: if you see the target, you touch it. It didn't look like a wide storm. It looked like a sighting. At this point, NASA already had several competing explanations, none of which were comfortable. The first, most reassuring, is an unknown natural effect in the millimeter range that somehow resonates with communication lines and electronics. It's rare, but not impossible. Space can be strange, and sometimes we overestimate our control. Second, a combination of natural phenomena and human error, amplified by our own infrastructure. In other words, we've created a situation where coincidences seem reasonable because we're all looking in the same direction at the same time. Third, a source that responds to us, not necessarily intelligence in the conventional sense. Perhaps it's a mechanism, an automaton, a system that activates under certain conditions, a system that no one has ever intended to explain to us. It simply does its thing. And if this is a system, then Atlas could be the key, the trigger, the precise object in the precise geometry that initiates the procedure. The word procedure sounds calm, but it's precisely this that frightens the most, because a procedure doesn't get angry, it doesn't intimidate, it doesn't bargain, it simply gets done. On the 30th day, something happened that led to the first real internal panic. The fallout window coincided with a brief failure of one of the power grid control satellites in the ocean region. This didn't lead to a catastrophe, but it did lead to the realization the impact wasn't just in space, it was affecting Earth through space. And here, people who never cared about comets suddenly become part of history, because if your civilization is connected by signals, then anyone who can reach the signals can reach your civilization. That evening, one of the leaders quietly said, "We must assume that this is surveillance, and that we are the object of surveillance." And that was the most honest formulation, because even if you don't believe in extraterrestrial things, you have to believe in statistics. And the statistics said, someone is watching, someone is checking, someone is measuring. On the 32nd day, NASA canceled some public observations, citing resource constraints. It seemed trivial, but those monitoring noticed something else. Independent observatories, which usually continue to monitor, had also gone silent. It was as if someone had asked them not to. And then a new fear emerged. What if the most important part of the story isn't what's happening, but what we're not allowed to see? After all, if you're testing the infrastructure, it's to your advantage to have the victim think it's technical problems. You'll gain time. You'll see reactions. You'll build a map. And the map is what any serious player does before pushing harder. On the 35th day, the pulses changed shape again. They became less frequent, but more powerful. The pulses became shorter but more precise. It seemed the system had reached its optimal state. It was as if the test had been completed and now it was being put into operation. And it was on this day that one of the teams noticed something most peculiar. During the pulses, the noise level in the receivers changed slightly, but not like during interference. It became clearer, as if the background was being leveled out, as if someone was making the radio space more organized for a few seconds. It looked as if the pulse wasn't destroying the communication channel, but rather restructuring the medium through which it passed. And if that's true, then the dropouts weren't the goal. They were a side effect. The goal was to create the conditions for something else, for transmission, for observation, for synchronization. At this point, even the most calm people began asking a question usually reserved for science fiction writers. What if this isn't a threat, but contact? Not a contact in the form of a beautiful message, but rather an intervention in the species infrastructure? Because infrastructure is the fastest way to understand a species. If you want to understand who we are, you don't look at our faces. You look at our networks, at how we transmit information, at what we protect, at what breaks first. Because civilization isn't about buildings, it's about rhythm. And so, if you look at it this way, the impulses in Sector Atlas look like an attempt to catch our rhythm, to adapt to it, or to rewrite it. On the 40th day, the story reached a point where it became impossible to hide. One of the major telecom operators publicly acknowledged short-term satellite link failures for unknown reasons. It sounded neutral, but that same day, independent radio amateurs posted a recording of the pulse, and it went viral. People weren't hearing space noise. They were hearing structure. The internet loves structure, because structure is meaning. And when people heard the noise repeating itself, they started asking questions. And questions are the most dangerous thing for systems that try to maintain a semblance of control. NASA then had to come out and say a few words about natural space phenomena. It was said calmly, but between the lines, it was clear they were trying to buy time, and time is the most important resource in this story because Atlas keeps flying, because the geometry is changing, because the windows will be different. Because if this is a test, then it too changes along with the geometry. And here we return to the most vexing question of the whole story. If this is a test, what happens when the test is over? Tests end in two ways. Either the system recognizes the target as unsuitable and shuts down, or the system recognizes the target as suitable and begins the next stage. We're currently living in a time warp where data keeps coming in, satellites continue to fall for minutes in return, radio telescopes continue to pick up pulses, and scientific groups continue to debate what exactly we're observing. But you know what's worst? The worst thing isn't that we don't know. The worst thing is that the picture looks like someone does. Because if you can send a narrow pulse from a sector of an interstellar object, synchronize it with our channels, and force several systems to silence simultaneously, leaving no trace of damage, then you can reach our infrastructure. And if you can reach, then you can choose the moment when to squeeze your fingers harder. And that's why this story resonates not only with comet lovers, it resonates with everyone who lives within the internet, even without noticing it, because it suddenly turns out that the network does not belong to us entirely. And as Atlas follows its trajectory, it's not just an object moving across the sky, it's a window moving across the sky, a window that someone is tapping on with pulses, testing how fast we blink. And if this is truly an infrastructure impact test, then the most terrifying question sounds simple. Not what is this? Why is it so neat? On the 41st day, someone at JPL said out loud what had previously only been written in closed notes. If the pulse targets, then it has optics, not glass, physical. It has a way to shape a narrow beam over interplanetary distances so that it hits our vulnerable windows. And then they did the obvious. They started looking for a lens, not in the instruments, but in the geometry itself. The position of Atlas, the position of the Earth, the position of the Sun, subtle angles that no one usually peers into. That very space, which we used to think of as empty, suddenly began to resemble an optical test bench. The first calculations seemed absurd. They suggested that the pulse became stronger when the Atlas-Earth line passed through the same region near the solar limb. It was as if the beam didn't travel directly, but was lifted at the edge, using the solar field as a guide. This wasn't a beautiful theory. It was a vile practicality. Someone knew how to use gravity and plasma as elements of a circuit. From that moment on, NASA stopped thinking in terms of interference and unknown effects. A new class of problems emerged, a controlled environment. If the environment is controlled, then treating the impulse as noise is pointless. You can close one window and another will open in response. You can change the frequency and the phase will be adjusted. In response, they did what they always do when they don't understand the intent. They tried to limit the consequences. They switched some critical systems to a more autonomous mode, staggered their schedules, and introduced blind periods, during which the devices were deliberately silent. The logic was bleak. If you're being tested for your reaction, stop reacting predictably. And yes, it did have an effect. But the effect wasn't what was expected. The pulses didn't disappear. They became smarter in timing. They began arriving precisely at the seconds when autonomous systems needed to briefly synchronize with Earth, right where any autonomy has a fine line. That was the first time I heard a thought that would disgust even the most unimaginative. If someone doesn't just see our channels but understands their schedules, then they're not just observing space. They're observing us. They're reading our architecture. They're modeling the infrastructure's behavior at the protocol level, not at the signal, present signal absent level. On the 43rd day, ALMA detected a strange tail component during one of its quiet intervals. Not the pulse itself, but what remained afterward, like an aftertaste. In the millimeter range, the spectrum looked as if someone had reflashed the medium for a few seconds and then it returned, but not perfectly. It was as if the cosmos was developing a memory, and this memory contained something familiar. Not words, not phrases, rhythm, modulations that were too reminiscent of old Earth radio signals to ignore, fragments of carriers, bits, distortions characteristic of human transmitters of the past. The frightening detail was that this wasn't a direct echo. It was jumbled and rearranged as if someone had taken our noise apart and reassembled it according to their own rules. From that moment on, the impact test ceased to be a simple power check. It became more like a recognition calibration, as if the system was trying to figure out which patterns were familiar to us and which weren't, which we'd notice immediately, which we'd miss, which we'd confuse with the background. At the same time, and almost no one noticed this in the news, several satellites returned after their outages with a small but repeatable quirk. The order of some of their service packets changed. Unnoticeable to the user, but noticeable to those who live in the logs. It looked as if someone had tampered with the logic, not the radio, for a few seconds. And then, the most unpleasant hypothesis of all was born because it didn't require aliens or magic. It required only one thing, a trigger, an external signal that activates what already exists. If a pulse can probe the electronics and protocols, it might not directly damage the system. It might awaken things it already knows how to do. It might trigger hidden modes, test procedures, factory functions that are never activated in real life, silent buttons, left in place just in case. On the 45th day, the word protocol appeared in one of the private messages. No embellishments, no panic, just the word. And next to it, a list of devices that had the same strange, logical transitions at that moment, too different to attribute to the same manufacturer, too similar in their reactions to be considered a coincidence. If this was a test, then it has moved to the system behavior level, and if the system's behavior changes synchronously at different points in orbit, then someone has gained access to more than one device. Someone has found a common lever. On the 46th day, when the pulse came again, something else was noticed at several monitoring stations. In those moments, it wasn't just communication channels that were failing. Trust between systems was collapsing. Automatic authentication checks were running in vain, as if the certificates had briefly ceased to be what they were. Then everything returned, but the fact itself was toxic. This wasn't just radio physics, it was a control loop. And here's where things get really cold. Because if someone can rewrite the trust map in a matter of seconds, they don't need to burn out the devices. They don't need to turn off the lights in cities. All they need to do is make the systems doubt each other once. The infrastructure is designed so that doubt spreads faster than any virus. On the 48th day, NASA tried the only thing left to do. Close the window, not in frequency, not in schedule, but in direction. They temporarily restricted the operation of some antennas in the Atlas sector, separated the telescopes, and curtailed joint sessions. It looked like a refusal to observe, like a capitulation to the unknown. But the impulse came anyway. It arrived not where they were looking, but where they least expected it, through reflected channels, through secondary pathways, through faint lines that are usually not taken seriously. It arrived as if the system didn't depend on whether we saw it or not. It depended only on geometry and on us. And then one of those people who rarely allows themselves to express emotion said almost in a whisper, if this is a trigger, it's not tied to the instruments. It's tied to the Earth, to our grid, to our noise, to our habit of filling the ether. And Atlas is simply a key that was inserted into the lock when the conditions were right. From that moment on, every coincidence began to look like preparation. Every brief glitch, a measurement of the reaction. Every return to normal, a sign that the goal wasn't destruction, but adjustment. Too subtle to be immediately frightening, strange enough to make you look up. And now the main question is different. Not what will happen if they press harder, but what has already been activated while we were arguing about what to call it. On the 49th day, they stopped arguing about what to call it and started counting the levels of the trigger. First, it touched communications, then protocols, then trust. Now it went deeper to where every system has its roots. The Deep Space Network noticed an oddity that couldn't be explained by a radio channel. Perfect telemetry packets appeared in the logs, seemingly pre-recorded. The signatures were correct, the timestamps were clear, but the sequence of events didn't match the spacecraft's physics. Inside NASA, they called it a telemetry double. Not a hacker-style fake, but something more sinister, as if someone could reproduce the correct response to any request without touching the device itself, like a protocol-level simulation of reality. ALMA received indirect confirmation. Short gaps in the background appeared in the millimeter range, each lasting a fraction of a second. They coincided in time with the moments when ground stations received these perfect packets. It was as if a piece of the sky had been cut out first, then the response inserted. Then they took a step usually reserved for the most challenging investigations. They stopped asking the devices about their condition. They started asking questions that couldn't be answered by a template. Microscopic tests for chaos, noise, and physical randomness. The result was such that the room fell silent. The answers weren't just correct, they were too smooth, too beautiful. They weren't riddled with the tiny errors that are inevitable in real telemetry. There weren't the rough edges that the universe makes when it's real. During the same time window, Parker's solar probe detected a short, almost musical rhythm in the solar wind. Not a storm or a surge, but a repeating pattern. When superimposed on the Atlas ephemeris, the marker fell precisely at the same time as the ALMA dips. Maven at Mars added another detail. During another communication breakdown, Earth noticed not only the loss of communication, but also strange plasma behavior in the Martian ionosphere. It was as if a pulse had passed along the Mars-Earth line, slightly altering the signal propagation conditions, and then a word no one wanted to write appeared in the reports: waveguide. The idea that the pulse doesn't just fly toward us, but travels through a pre-selected medium, through the solar corona, through plasma, through the planetary magnetic tails, like a cable. The scariest part was that the cable didn't need to be built. It already exists. We live inside a giant plasma structure, and if someone knows how to tune it, they can deliver energy and information anywhere without leaving the usual traces. A classified JPL report featured a diagram of 3 dots: Atlas, the solar limb, and a narrow sector of Earth over the ocean, where these fallout events most frequently occurred. The lines were so neat that they looked like a diagram, rather than a representation of cosmic dynamics. After that, decisions became tense. Some satellites were switched to minimum radiation mode, as if silence could save them. But silence didn't. The activations continued, only now they were interfering with what was silent. Inertial sensors, timers, onboard clocks. And then something happened that hit everyone at once, even the skeptics. Several independent atomic clocks on different continents showed a microshift, synchronous with the pulse. Too small to be news, but too consistent to be a fluke. This didn't mean time was broken. It meant something worse. Someone had found a way to influence synchronization, the foundation of any modern infrastructure, for seconds at a time. If you control synchronization, you control the meaning of signals. When Hubble was raised to compare archival footage of the sector where the pulse occurred, they found a thin green haze that shouldn't have been there. Not bright, not obvious. It was precisely the kind that in the past would have been written off as sensor noise and discarded, but it repeated itself in different observation series, and it repeated itself in exactly the same geometry where the ATL, AS Sun-Earth line now lies. It was as if the trace wasn't in the comet, but in the signal's path, like a mark on the road that you only notice when you know where to look. And then, history acquired a new center of gravity. Maybe Atlas isn't a threat as an object, maybe it's a threat as a key, as a synchronizer, as something that makes the existing spatial structure behave as if it were part of a system. If this is true, then the most dangerous moment isn't when the comet is close, but when the geometry aligns perfectly. When the entire cable is in place and any of our devices, any network, any satellite becomes not a target, but a component of the circuit. And at that very moment, at the same hour, several spacecraft crashed again, for short periods of time, for the same minutes. And when they returned, there was a new trace in the logs. Not an error or a glitch, but a neat marker, as if someone had ticked a box. Section completed. The next day, they stopped calling them anomalies. A different word appeared within the reports: checkpoints. It sounded almost calm until it became clear that the marks were increasing, like steps someone was climbing. The frightening thing was that the marker wasn't left by just one device. It was seen on different networks, on different frequencies, on different continents. This meant the tick didn't belong to a specific device. It belonged to an event that permeated everything. Then one of the DSN engineers suggested a crude test. If it was a test, it had a pass-fail criterion. He suggested intentionally distorting one of the responses, not by breaking the system, but by introducing harmless noise into the return channel. In a normal world, this would have looked like a protocol error. Here, it looked like a challenge, and the reaction came almost instantly. The next time, the pulse shifted to a different minute, a different station, a different relay chain, as if the examiner had bypassed a trap. At that moment, Alma detected something strange in the tail of the millimeter wave radiation. Short packets resembling a pseudo-random code appeared in the spectrum, but the code was all too familiar. It resembled the synchronization structure of old Earth signals. Not phrases, not voices, not music. It's the skeleton, how we break noise into sections, how we mark the beginning, how we set a checksum, as if someone were learning from our habits, copying not the content, but the method. JPL attempted to recreate this scheme in a simulator. If we assume that Atlas is not the source, but a geometry switch, then the pulse would look like a key to phase synchronization. Not a signal to us, but a signal through us. And at that moment, it became clear why the dropouts were always short. They didn't need to maintain a channel, they needed to enter the transition, that narrow gap where the device switches modes and for a second, trusts the outside world more than itself. A day later, something happened that made people at NASA keep quiet. One of the spacecraft returned from its fall with its power-saving mode altered. Not damaged, not hacked, obviously, simply switched as if the command had come from within. At first, they tried to blame it on the software, but a checksum check revealed that the firmware hadn't been modified. The logs confirmed that the command had arrived correctly, according to the rules, with a valid signature. The problem was, no one had sent it. When we dug up the manufacturer's old test documents, we discovered a terrifying coincidence. Within the service mode, there existed a hidden calibration protocol, reserved for factory test benches. Under normal circumstances, it shouldn't have been activated at all, and here's where things got even worse, because the protocol turned out not to be unique. Similar service doors were found in other systems, from other manufacturers, in other generations. Different names, different commands, the same philosophy. A back door. The pulse from Sector Atlas didn't seem to be picking locks. It was finding spare keys we'd left in our pockets. It didn't argue with our security. It bypassed it through a service reality where security wasn't a priority. They attempted to connect JWST to observations through these windows to see the source in infrared. Again, the command was technical reasons, but a trace remained in the telemetry. The sensor was picking up a perfectly black field, without background noise, as if someone was jamming not the object, but the universe itself. When this was compared with ALMA, it turned out that the black field coincided with the millimeter-sized dips, at the same second, in the same sector, as if space had momentarily become neither transparent nor solid, but switched off. And then, someone finally said something that had previously sounded too outlandish. Perhaps an impulse isn't radiation in the conventional sense. Perhaps it's a modulation of the medium, as if you weren't sending a wave through water, but changing the water itself for a second. If so, then all our antennas, all our receivers, all our defenses were secondary. They listened to the consequences, but couldn't see the cause. The cause was the way the path between points was rearranged for seconds, as if someone were relaying the tracks, and the most disturbing thing, these adjustments became more frequent, not by the day, but by the hour. With each checkpoint, the window between pulses shortened and the geometric matching became more precise. The reports called this tightening. Someone at JPL described it simply, it's locking in, it clicks. The system tunes the resonance and adjusts it to the earth, to our networks, to our noise, not by hitting it, by tuning it, like an instrument before a concert. At the end of the day, a new data packet arrived from several communication satellites. They dropped synchronously for 19 seconds, exactly 19. And when they returned, all four had the same tiny trace, the same rounding error in one field of the packet. The error was too small to cause any damage, but too uniform to be a fluke. It looked like a watermark, like a signature left, not for the sake of function, but for the sake of confirmation. We can repeat this anywhere, and that's when real panic set in, because this was no longer a communications exam. It had become a demonstration of access to the layer where our standards reside, where all of humanity had agreed on the rules, and now someone was showing they could tamper with them. That night, the final report for the day arrived. It contained one sentence, dry and terrifying. Next window is the closest geometry. And next to it stood a timer until a match occurred, which could no longer be scheduled. And at that moment, the question ceased to be scientific. It became human. If the impulse is the key, and the key is already entered, then what exactly will it reveal when the match is perfect?